Hello and welcome to the Applied HR module summary. Thanks again for your time and input on the three workshops. I hope you enjoyed them. And the aim of this particular summary is to summarize the key points and the material that we covered during the first three workshops, and hopefully to reinforce and for you to, if you didn't quite pick it up on the workshop, some of the elements, hopefully this will reinforce some of the material that we actually covered. Remember, on the actual module itself there are 8 units, and over the three workshops we covered 1 to 7. I mentioned to you that unit 8, that you can obviously read that in your own time. I didn't feel that it was relevant specifically to the project. Although it's got useful material in Unit 8, Units 1 to 7 were more important for the project, but please feel free to look at Unit 8 because it has areas such as managing diversity, work-life balance and managing stress. So what we'll do now is we're going to cover some of the key points that we looked at. I'm going to bring out some of the key models and we'll just have a brief overview of each one. So let's just start back again just briefly on, we looked at what is HRM. Remember, there are lots of different definitions to understand here. Probably one of the most important definitions to date that's been used by Boxall and Purcell is that HRM is all those activities associated with the management of work and people in organisations. Well, absolutely, totally agree with that. And what we're looking at here is a set of practices or activities and their application, and it can be viewed as a system, and as part of that system, the system obviously helps manage people at work essentially. So HRM is concerned with a set of practices and their application and can be viewed as a system for management of people at work. And the important thing is that HRM is very important for all organisations, but it's only taken seriously if it can demonstrate impact. And I mentioned that to you on the module in terms of recent sort of trends and transitions of more senior people working in HR, and where they can show the impact and they can show where it makes a difference. And essentially HRM, if it's part of a function, part of a department or part of the Ulrichs model, is there to add value to support the needs of the business. Some of the key features obviously with HRM are very important too, and this is one good way of helping us to differentiate between personnel management and HRM. And there were 6 key features that we focused on and which we went back to a few times during the first workshop in particular, and obviously during workshops 2 and 3 as well. And we first see that HRM is strategic and that it's integrated into the business needs. So the HR strategy, if there is one, needs to be there to support the needs of the business. So we spoke about companies such as Lidl or Tesco's or Marks and Spencer's, where the HR strategy is there to reinforce and to add value to meet the needs of the business strategy, which is very important. And then we see coherence. So HR practices ideally should be synergized together, integrated, so they reinforce each other, and that's extremely important then as well for performance. And I think I used the example there of if we're recruiting for, say, conscientiousness or quality, that can then move through the other practices in terms of recruitment, selection, reward, training, development, and it becomes synergized. Remember, the coherence is part of the horizontal fit. And of course, on top of that, what you need is specific policies and procedures which drive those particular practices. But there needs to be some thinking done here in terms of how they can reinforce each other, and in particular, obviously, add value. Commitment, very, very important, as we saw with the Harrods case study, trying to connect staff in terms of the mission, vision, values, very important. People treated as assets, extremely important. And one of the three approaches to employee relations, we have the unitarist approach, which is individual bargaining, high trust, the whole idea of people can voice their opinion sort of direct rather than indirect through a union. And the philosophy here is that management and employees share the same interests. There's a lack of conflict, or a lesser conflict, I should say. Remember, this model is introduced from the US, and at the time of its inception, it would have been when there was very low or interaction with trade unions in the private sector. So from a European perspective, it's quite difficult to introduce that particular model, although it can be introduced pretty quickly in areas such as greenfield or what we call brownfield sites, where the organisation has evolved from scratch. Obviously, as a startup, it's far easier then to introduce that particular approach. But the emphasis here is on high trust. And the final feature is extremely important, and it's all to do with the line manager and the whole idea that line managers deliver HRM and it's their responsibility. And we know from the workshops that this is an issue here, because there's research which shows that line managers don't know what they're supposed to be doing, they're not sure of the agenda, and they're asking, well, why am I doing this? Because I'm an operations manager, or I'm a sales manager. So again, that was another issue that we spoke about. The HR system we spoke about briefly before. Again, this is a lot of detail, but essentially there's a philosophy behind the system, and that's to do with how we understand people, what are our values around people, where do people come in the pecking order of importance in the workplace. And that's supported by a HR strategy, policies, procedures, practices. And as you can see there, from a teaching and learning perspective, the HR practices were organised by categories. It's not really a great framework, this, but I think it was just shown to show you that there are different practices here which come under these headings. But feel free to have a heading on its own as training and development, that's fine as well. And as you can see, induction is not even on this, so it should be here somewhere. But things like recruitment, selection, they're two separate practices. Organisation, job design, employee engagement, which would cover all these anyway. But most of you in your groups are looking at performance, reward, which covers all of these things, training and development, recruitment, selection, of some of the main ones. Of course, the way to organise your practices would be to just focus on the units, how the units are broken down. So for example, with Unit 6, rewarding and managing performance, there's two practices there. There's reward management and there's performance management. There's two separate practices or activities. Brings us then to the whole idea of personal management and HRM, and we looked at the guest model. You can see there straight away the whole idea of time and planning, that personnel is very much more short term, reactive and ad hoc. In other words, it's very much chasing what needs to be done. It's always reactive around the needs of the business, whereas HRM is more forward thinking, it's proactive, strategic, integrated. And there you can see the commitment there and the compliance for the contract, psychological contract we spoke about. Causal chain, John Purcell, the whole idea here of line managers being important, but more importantly the idea of their attitude towards the HR practice. So we have what's written on paper, remember, And then we have the whole idea of how it's carried out, the attitude, how it's experienced by staff, their attitude, how it affects them, their behaviour, and the outcome. So the more positive, the more there is a focus towards importance of HR practices, the better the outcomes or performance outcomes. That was found. Another area we looked at was best practice versus best fit of HRM, and the whole idea here is that with best practice HRM, there are a set of universal practices which are used, which can be used anywhere. So Jeffrey Pfeffer's research in America suggested that these practices can be used and were used by the Fortune Top 100 companies, and it can be used for high performance and high commitment. And of course we know that there are other best practice research studies done, and they're all saying different things. So that brings into question the idea of consistency, and the issue obviously here, best practice, is which one is best practice. So how can it be universal? In other words, we can use these practices in Ireland, we can use them in America, but because of the research and the issues, more recently best fit seems to be the main focus. And obviously with best fit, it's to do with what fits the organisation in terms of their needs and their culture and their strategy. So we will use practices and tweak them and use them and operate them to fit the needs of our business in terms of what we're trying to achieve, to support the business strategy unique to that company, its culture. If you think about best practice, in some companies, self-managed teams just wouldn't work. They'd have to have, high contact with managers, or even an individual type work, job design. So that's where the best fit seems to be more widespread, because it's down to the fitting to meet the needs of the business, its culture, and the strategy. So as a key summary of the first 3 units, Unit 1 then was the introduction, and we covered some of the HRM background material. Unit 2 was about HRM in context, and Unit 3 was about the best practice HRM. Other things we looked at were the evolution of HRM, the whole idea of how HRM evolved because of the 1980s recession, and the idea that Asia was able to do things quicker, better quality. So we needed to look at competitive advantage through people, and that's how the HRM models of high commitment, etc. evolved. Best fit, I should say, and best practice evolved out of the Harvard and Michigan models. We also looked at the HR service delivery methods in terms of how HR is delivered, either through the Ulrich model, obviously the three-legged stool, and through the traditional HR department. You have a handout on that as well, which goes into more detail. We also spoke about the line manager, again very, very important part of HRM as part of the system. And finally, HRM in context, we looked at the whole idea of PEST and SWOT, and the idea that PEST, obviously the external environment, has a big impact on organisations in terms of the economy, social demographics, legislation, and many other things as well. So moving on to Unit 4, we looked at resourcing, and again this was pretty much about the recruit selection process, and we went through a couple of models. Workforce planning obviously was done first, so the whole idea of HR plans in terms of do we need to recruit, do we need to downsize, do we need more flexibility, do we need to incentivize staff we've already got, do we need to retain staff. If we need to recruit, of course, we have a process where we have to conduct a good job analysis. the job description, person specification and terms and conditions, and more recently the use of a competency framework, which is more contemporary. As part of recruiting and selecting, of course, two different stages. In more recent years we see the use of e-recruitment, the whole idea of online recruitment, which is quicker, faster and more efficient, or supposed to be, but obviously there are issues as well there. Different types of recruitment, different methods I should say, and of course there are different types of selection methods too. Best practice I think is to find what works for the company, but generally for selection normally two or more methods are widely used, and the point here is that the more data you have about the person, employee, the better informed decision that you can make. The other thing as well about the resourcing processes is that it's good to evaluate when you've gone through a complete cycle. The important thing here is to go back to see, well, how could you make things better? How could the process improve? Did we recruit somebody? What were the quality of the candidates like? Could we save money here through doing things more efficiently? And more importantly, did the employee or candidate feel they were treated fairly? That's very important too. Unit 5 then looked at the training and development or learning and development system, and obviously we looked at induction as part of a separate area. We mainly focused on the training system in terms of how organisations train staff, and there were four main stages. Stage 1 was to do with the training needs analysis, the TNA, in terms of finding out what staff needs were, in terms of bridging the gap on what they need. That mainly comes through the individual level in terms of appraisal or performance, and we find out there that staff may need training, etc. Also as well, staff, remember, they also ask managers if they want training or they want to go on a course, so again that's important too. Design, very important. From the needs we identify objectives, and then we've got to think about the design of the program. Is it going to be done by our own staff, or are we going to outsource the training? We've got to think about the venue, select staff for the program, and we need support as well in terms of resource, finance and support from managers to let staff go on the program or wherever the training is. And stage 3, we've got to think about training. Is it going to be on the job or off the job? And then finally the Kirkpatrick model, stage 4, is all about evaluation. So Kirkpatrick identified reaction, testing, behaviour and results as part of some of the ways that we can evaluate. Obviously reaction via questionnaires would be the initial approach, but we need to think about testing people to see what they've learned. We need to think about behaviour to see what people have learned and how their behaviour has changed. That can be done through appraisal before and after. And finally, one of the key aspects of training and development is to see what the return on investment was in terms of the impact from a results perspective in terms of the training. One of the problems though with the stage 4 of 4 on results here is that it's difficult to say for sure that it was the training that increased performance, because there can be many other things, but they can give us a correlation. We can find a link, but it's very difficult to find a cause, because it could have been many things. It could have been the weather that changed, it could have been customer attitudes change, but generally it can give us an idea as to how training, how it helps us to raise performance. So unit 6, then we moved on to performance and reward. And as part of the performance side of things, we looked at the framework in front of you, and I mentioned to you about the 4 parts of the cycle: staff expectations, measurement, development and reward. The first 2 you traditionally find in most organisations. Well, in fact the expectation might not be there, but staff would definitely in some sense get measured in terms of their feedback. In fact, in some organisations you'll get nothing, but for those that do have measurement, feedback is very important. Through appraisal generally, and then we may see some elements of development through coaching, or then on top of that then reward. It's important to have reward and development as part of that cycle, so that's good practice. But I think more importantly, the idea of performance management needs to be sort of well thought out around the expectations, what your goals are, what your targets are, and a joint exercise where both manager and employee have set the goals jointly rather than individually, so you can set your own performance targets. That's important to have that say. And performance management should be on a regular basis. It shouldn't be once a year. It should be an ongoing conversation, not just a formal procedure, which obviously is important, but it's about the manager understanding staff on a day-to-day basis, and to not to micromanage, but just to get a sense of how things are. But like I said before, development and reward are very two important aspects as well of the cycle. And of course it needs to be taken seriously rather than thinking, well, as we saw on the causal chain, if appraisals seem to be not important, the whole thing just doesn't work. On the reward side, remember we looked at the intrinsic and extrinsic types of reward, the whole idea that different people want different things depending on their needs, and we looked at a few trends such as the performance related pay, and we also looked at the cafeteria approach. But one of the most contemporary models used is the total reward framework, which is a holistic approach to reward, and we looked at the RBS case study in terms of going beyond pay, where we see benefits, learning and development, and the work environment involved. So it's the total package, if you like, that employees focus on. And the idea is that we're meeting people's needs, and there's a sense of individuality in terms of the rewards they receive, a focus on them, so they can choose within that package what they would like. The final unit, Unit 7, that we looked at was employee relations, and we looked at employee voice initially, then we looked at how things have moved on from voice and more contemporarily to the employee engagement, which is about how staff have a sense of willingness and a focus on wanting to make a difference to an organisation, and more importantly willing to work with other people and highly motivated. So engagement is about wanting to come to work, wanting to make a difference, wanting to work with other people, and the way that we drive this in organisations is through, as you can see, a recent study by the CIPD. We looked at 6 drivers of engagement. So person job fit, meaningfulness of work, a supportive work environment, senior management communication and vision, line management, the quality of the management, and finally the voice, being able to voice your views upwards. So those 6 areas were looked at as to have been important towards driving engagement, and on the workshop we looked at Harrods and the whole idea of engagement and how that drove performance and employee commitment.